So I'm going to build through this architecture. There are more layers in the architecture than the v4 version. So I'm hoping this will help everyone understand what these different pieces are and what they do, right? So at the base layer here are the data transfer nodes. This is, hopefully everyone is following what ESNet puts out as best practices here, and you have these DTNs that are set up for use for movement, for data movement. Then the endpoint, as it is in the v5 architecture, is only about the server configuration and the network configuration, right? So it's a pretty constrained piece here rather than what it meant in v4. So the endpoint is where you have the management interface and you configure your data nodes. Then if you have multiple DTNs, you configure each of those. And you also configure your network parameters. What is the concurrency you want, parallelism you want, all of that. So really server and network is what the endpoint piece is. And your user should never have to find this endpoint because they can access data on this. This is all an administrative interface, right? So users never have to find this. So then you add a connector. By default, you get a POSIX connector, which is how we speak with the file system. And then this next construct on top of that are the storage gateways. They are really about access policies and configuration, right? On a storage gateway, you say what type of storage you want to touch. You talk about what user authentication identities that you need when somebody accesses collections on that gateway. You determine whether it requires higher assurance or not. So it's really a policy configuration. We'll go into detail on what policies you can configure, but this is what allows us to partition the same DTN across multiple storage types, right? So you can create a storage gateway of type POSIX and then a storage gateway of type Google Drive or S3 or what have you, right? So it's all about the storage system and then partitioning that storage system. You also decide what part of the storage system is exposed through that storage gateway. So those are all the pieces there. Again, a user hardly ever looks at this. They shouldn't have to come to this at all, right? There are no data interfaces. This is again an admin construct, right? If you are supporting multiple connectors, then you would add that connector in the GCS install, and then you would create a storage gateway that determines policy for that connector, right? So for example, in this S3 one, we talk about what domain is required, identities from which domain is required to access it, how often should a user authenticate on these, and so on. So some of that policies there. And then comes the collections piece. So collection is what a user accesses. That is the only thing they would find. That is where the data interfaces are, right? That's where you come to pull data out using grid FTP or HTTPS. And there are two types of collections, which is a reflection of what was there in v4, right? Mapped collections are named creatively as mapped because you map a user to a local account, right? Essentially, it requires that the user have a local account on that system, and you go from the identity they authenticate with and map it to a local essentially account, a Unix account or an S3 bucket. So these map collections, as you can see from this fantastic picture that Vitas has drawn, he takes all our PowerPoint sketches and turns them into these graphics. So kudos to him for all these graphics. So if you are sitting on a storage gateway that is high assurance, you can only have collections that are high assurance. So they will have to meet the policy requirements of high assurance data access. If you have storage gateways that are not high assurance, then the policy requirements are different. So these map collections are where users come to access data. And it has, so anyway, I can get rid of this. Is there anyone with Zoom who can tell me how I can get rid of this? It was on my list, thank you. Thank you. And then of these mapped collections, if somebody does sharing, somebody wants to share the data, and what was called shared endpoints in GCS4 are called guest collections. So they are providing access to guest users to subsets of the data of that mapped collection. So user then authenticates to the mapped collection, picks up a folder or whatever they want to give access to, and then sets permission for someone else to access, right? So it seems multiple layers, but we have partitioned it so it can support multiple storage connectors and such. But from a user perspective, they should only ever be searching for collections, accessing data through collections, creating guest collections, setting permissions on that. They should never have to find endpoints and storage gateways, right? So that's sort of from a user perspective, that's not where they go for data access. Okay. Okay, so that's the high-level architecture. Yes, Lev.
POSIX connector is easy, but let's say AWS. Now, something in the cloud. Will the transfer happen between the AWS bucket and destination directly, or will it go? Yeah.
So when you install a GCS5 with AWS that acts as a conduit, the data from S3 goes through that GCS to the destination, but it's never written to disk. It's just sort of in memory, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Correct. It is not a direct client access. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So people who are new and just wanted to learn about how to do GCS5, bear with me for like 10 minutes while I talk about this comparison, right? I think it's going to resonate with a lot of you who have run these V4 endpoints for a long time. So terminology wise, whatever you thought of as host endpoints in V4 are mapped collections now, right? That's where users come and access data. It requires a local account for access. This is the vast, vast majority of all your deployments on campuses and institutions, right? People log in and then you map them to a local account. What was called shared endpoint, which is where people come in and create a shared endpoint and set permissions for collaborators to access data, is now guest collections. The model is the exact same. We have not changed the underlying security. It still respects all the same permissions it used to before, right? That you can set restricted paths, you can set who's allowed to share, and we'll show you how to do all of that in V5. People used to use a host endpoint to create shared endpoints. If you remember, you log into your institution, like I would log into University of Chicago as Midway, pick my folder, and then create a shared endpoint, and then set permissions for someone from another institution to access, right? Now you would go and log into a mapped collection and then create that guest collection and set permission, right? Sure.
Question in the chat from asking you to repeat all the questions in the audience.
Oh, yes.
So if you want to repeat.
Thank you, Carl. I will. So Lev's question was, if you had an S3 collection, what does the data flow look like from Amazon to the destination? And the data flow goes from the S3 bucket through the GCS endpoint that has been set up with the S3 connector to the destination. But the data is not written to disk. It's just sort of a memory. It's in memory and then it gets pushed to destination. So it is not directly from S3 to destination. So that was his question. Thanks, Richard. Okay, this is wordy slides. We're going to make this available, but I just wanted to put it out there and do a quick overview. So again, people who have administered V4 for a long time, I think it will hopefully be helpful for you to map this, right? So credentials for endpoints. When you installed V4, the first thing you did was went and created a Globus ID, and that is not needed anymore. In V5, we do not use Globus ID. We have you register the version 5 endpoint as an application in Globus. So it's an OAuth application with a client ID and secret, and you'll see how that is done today. So it eliminates the need for Globus ID. You also can have other administrators have access to that client ID secret. You can rotate that secret. So it really enhances, there is no password sharing of that Globus ID with other admins or anything like that, right? So that's one. And then policy and data interfaces. In V4, it was all static. If you made configuration change, our much loved config file was edited and you would run GCS setup again and make those changes. The config file is what stored all that and just moved along, right? In V5, there is no such sort of single file. We essentially have you provide the configuration information that is stored both locally and synchronized, encrypted with a cloud service, so that across your multiple DTNs, the configuration changes are automatically propagated. And if somehow your DTNs just completely get fizzed and you have to start from scratch, as long as you have your client ID secret and that encryption key that you only have, that Globus does not have, you can restore completely from the cloud backup, right? We'll go through this. You will see that encryption key. I just want to say we have no way of bringing things back if you lose your encryption key. And that is by design. We want to make sure your configuration is protected and whatever is in the cloud is completely encrypted, right? So that's the way to set up. And data access was only grid FTP in V4. With V5, you get grid FTP and HTTPS, but you as an admin have controls. You can turn on and turn off HTTPS. You can disable anonymous access to HTTPS. So you have lots of controls on what you allow there, right? Server credentials in V4, when you installed it, by default, we issued a certificate, but you also could set up your own custom certificate. I think a lot of people used either InCommon CA or other certificate authorities of choice. In V5, the default certificate comes from Let's Encrypt because we needed to support HTTPS. We needed something that was browser compatible, right? But you also can bring in your own custom certificates, just like you did with V4. So that's a server credentials. On the management interface, all of it was on the DTN. You changed a configuration file, reran, and set it up. On the on V5, there is actually a GCS manager service with a REST API, and you can essentially, and there's a client that is shipped with it, so you can be on the machine essentially setting up and updating configuration. But the vision is that the plan is that the command line will get merged with the Globus CLI. So you could be, not necessarily on the DTN and still make some updates to it and so on. So there is a actual service that is you're able to use for management. And I think this is the last one here. All the management roles, I'm going to say largely unchanged. We made some enhancements, but the enhancements applies to both V4 and V5, but it's largely unchanged. You can have administrators, managers, monitors. You can come in through the management console and see all the traffic. All of that hasn't really had materially changed. We've added some features there, right? High assurance data access is simply not supported in V4. V5 obviously supports that. You set up a storage gateway with it and then collections on that, right? And then the user authentication to data happens using, in V4, we were using X509 certificates. We used OAuth MyProxy or either through the InCommon one, the CA logon one, or the MyProxy OAuth. Whereas here we moved to OIDC. So first you could set something up that simply uses identities that is used to log into Globus, right? So if you have your identity provider already integrated, if you see it in the dropdown, you can use that domain when you set up, no additional configuration is needed. Or if you run another OIDC server on your campus that's already available, you can integrate that in and use it. Or Globus ships an OIDC server stack with GCS if you want to stand something new and use a PAM module and plug it in with your authentication system, right? So that the last one that I described would be if you are running a MyProxy OAuth today with a PAM module linked to your local authentication, you would shift to using this OIDC server with a PAM module and local authentication, right? So all those options work. It really just changes how we get that authentication assertion back. We used to get them as X509 certificates that we cached and used DNs. Now we are getting them as OIDC claims, and we pick the identity from there and use that for mapping, right? It's just change in protocol, makes it more browser friendly, which means I can go do a HTTPS download. It will nicely redirect me to that OIDC server. I authenticate, I come back and I can get my data, right? So the same security applies both places. And then the last one, mapping to local account. The mapping that was there was being done from a X509 DN to a local account, or if you are using CA logon, we were just using the identity there. From now, you're going to use the identity name, right? So if I authenticate to Globus as rachna@uchicago.edu, you're going to figure out how to map rachna@uchicago.edu to a local account. Vast majority of deployments we see, you probably strip the @uchicago.edu, and that's the local account, and that's a flag in GCS v5. You say that's what you want to use. But you could do all kinds of fancy custom mapping, and Joe will talk about it when he does the walkthrough or when we do the identity piece, right? But essentially, we provide the authentication context. You have all the information about the user, and you can decide how that gets mapped. And then you can do custom domain names for collections. So you can have users, you can set up a domain name for a particular mapped collection. So the user is, for example, coming into, I don't know, data.uchicago.edu rather than say, here is your UUID for that endpoint, right? You can actually have some domain names set up for that. So that's the comparison. I know it's a lot, and it probably people who have adminning V4 for a long time get this as I speak through it, but we'll publish this slide deck, so take a look at it as well. And if you have any questions, either now or during the office hours, please feel free to ask us or contact us and support us as well, right? Bridget, anything online? Okay. Okay, so this is a simplified architecture picture of Wi-Fi just to situate all the components, right? So on the data transfer node, you have the grid FTP server. And this is what I was talking about when I said there is a GCS manager service, which is what you interact with for setting up configuration, right? And there is a command line client that is shipped with it, and you use that to set up all these. And essentially, you're talking to this GCS manager service. Behind the scenes, the manager service is automatically syncing all this configuration with an AWS service called AppSync. It's completely encrypted. And then it pushes all the configuration changes to your multiple DTNs, right? That's sort of how it's set up. And then on the cloud side, nothing has changed. You have the Globus transfer service that is still a client to GCS, and Globus Auth is used for everything from how your GCS manager authenticates to how the transfer service authenticates and all of that, right? We pretty much fundamentally be using OAuth tokens across the board for all of those. Okay, Joe spotted an error. He'll tell me later. Okay.
The colors are strange.
Oh, really? Okay, interesting. This one is dying. Yeah. Okay. So that's the concept overview. Any questions, anything I can answer on terminology, any of the architecture pieces before we jump in and do some walkthroughs? Okay, so this section walks through a brand new V5 install, right? If you're setting up a new V5 installation, what does that look like? I cannot stress enough the documentation that is out there. There is detailed documentation on setting this through. There are lots of different guides. If you go to docs.globus.org and Globus Connect Server, that's the landing page. You will see some introduction terminology and then links to this. There is a really detailed guide that walks through every section for you if you're doing custom identity mapping, data access, and so on. There is also a quick start guide. If you're doing sort of a vanilla install for testing, all you need is a POSIX and you want to quickly walk through that, that's a good place to start. And then it points you to other pieces, right? So both of those are valuable resources. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at it, so that as you're doing your installation and customization of your configuration, those guides are really, really helpful, right? Even if you're migrating, you will end up doing a V5 vanilla install. So the way migration works is that you're going to set up a new V5, and then the tool is going to read your V4 configuration and magically apply it to V5, right? So yes, there's a lot of magic involved. So this is very much relevant for anyone who's doing new V5 installs, but also anyone who's thinking about migration. You will do a vanilla install through this, right? VAS has very helpfully set up some handy links. If you go to bit.ly GW-TUT for Globus World tutorial, there is a cheat sheet. There is also a link to a spreadsheet that has information about how you can claim an EC2 instance. If you want to follow along in this path, at some point, if you're looking for, at some point, some of the features are subscription only. At that point, you could actually put your identity and we will give you the subscription manager rights so that you can try out those features as well. So it's a pretty handy link to keep as we go through this, right? So it's bit.ly/GW-TUT. Somebody could post that on Zoom for, Bridget, can you just put this on Zoom for remote attendees? Thank you. Okay, the way this is going to work is I'm going to do an overview of the install. Just the talking bits are mine. And then the real work Joe is going to do, he's going to come up and do a walkthrough and you can follow along, right? So this is a summary of what we are going to do. We are going to register a Globus Connect server because that's how you start all your GCS5 installs. Like I said, there is no Globus ID. And whatever credentials you get here is what you use for the GCS piece. Then we'll install the packages. They're already done on your demo machines. End up adding some nodes to it. Then create gateways, map collections, guest collections, the whole 9 yards, right? So we'll actually go through all of that so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so to register GCS and get credentials, we go to developers.globus.org. That is our Globus Auth page for registering any applications or resource servers. If you go in there, you'll be able to log in and you will see that there's a notion of projects there. It essentially allows you to group all of your registration under a single project, and projects can have multiple admins, right? So we strongly suggest that you have more than one person in your team have access to it. We cannot retrieve these things if you truly, it's a very difficult, we are put in a very difficult position if you ask us to do anything with there, because somebody says somebody has left and we'll have to make judgment calls about whether we reset this thing or not. But the client secret, you have to protect that and have access to it, right? So you can go in and add a Globus Connect server. It essentially creates, for those of you who are familiar with OAuth parlance, it's a resource server. It automatically knows with scopes and all of that. And then it generates a client ID and secret there. And that's what you would use in your initial GCS setup. In V4, you would have used your Globus ID username and password. In this case, you would use this client ID and secret, right? And this is sort of a screenshot. This is what that looks like. You register it, generate a new client secret. It gives that you copy it. And as that big yellow box says, this is not something we can regenerate for you, right? So then the second step is to actually install those packages. This is already done on the demo machines because BAS is very helpful. You set all this up on your demo machines there. And then you go through and run the setup, right? So remember, if you remember the architecture picture, this is the lowermost rung. This is an endpoint. All you're doing is setting up the servers and configuring sort of your network parameters. So this is not something a user sees, but you want to give it a reasonable name, organization, so you can find it yourself later, the client ID, and you can set someone as the owner, because the GCS itself is owned by that client ID secret. It's not user friendly, so it's good to set someone as an owner on that piece. And this is again something Joe will show you and talk about how to make changes to that. And then you start to add a node. This second step is where for every DTN you're adding, you would add a node to it with the same client ID and secret. Right? So the first one, you set up the endpoint, then add a node, and then every additional DTN you will just add as a new node. The endpoint is a single construct that has multiple nodes in it. Okay. The endpoint setup command generates this deployment key.json that has the key. And like we said, that is not something the hosted cloud service has. We cannot retrieve that for you. That is used as an encryption key for all the configuration that is stored and synced in AppSync. This is to protect your installations and sort of do separation of concerns. Configuration is managed by the institution. Globus is just taking that blob and syncing it and pushing it through all those machines. You're definitely going to need it to manage anything on this, right? To reestablish your endpoint, to be able to add new DTNs and all of that. So when that is done, that's how far we would have gotten, right? You have an endpoint construct, you'd have added a node with the POSIX, default POSIX connector in it. That diagram should have POSIX in there. Right? And then to add new nodes, these are Vas's slides. So he's really thought this one through. To add new nodes, you essentially go ahead and add a new node setup. You're not setting up a new endpoint. The endpoint setup is done once. You're just adding new nodes to that endpoint, right? Okay, actually, I'll stop here. Any questions, any corrections, guys? Anything else? No. Okay. Any questions? Anybody, anyone online? Yes.
So you mentioned that we can add other people to our developers
Yeah.
projects.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing how to do that, but maybe I'll stop that down.
Yeah, so there must be a drop down near the project admin. Sorry. So Todd's question was whether you can add more admins to the project registration, the endpoint registration. It should be on the developers page, and he was asking how to do that. Well, I can do a demo of that in a few minutes here, right? So yes, you should be able to add multiple people. Josh.
If I had a failure on that, again, all I need is the JSON file on that.
You will need the client ID, secret, and the deployment key. Oh, sorry. I'll get there by the end of the session. So the question was, if there is a failure on one of the nodes to essentially add it back in, what do we need? You will need your client ID, secret, and the deployment key to be able to put that back in. Yes. Okay. Gigi, you had a question. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So Gigi's question was, if you go back to this command, thank you. There is a owner here. Essentially, we are forcing that to be added because, like she pointed out, if you don't do that, then the GCS installation is only owned by that client ID, which has no association with you. So you won't be able to find it in our system. And the only way you can interact with it is through that client ID and secret. But to interact with it using your credentials or other admin credentials, you need to add that. Right? So that's a well-placed question. I'm sure she's getting support requests on that. So she asks it as a question when she knows the answer. So that's fantastic. Okay. Anything else? Yes, Lev.
This is probably relevant for the current V4 plan. When I'm creating the V5 project, should I do it with my institutional V4 Globus ID or me as myself, my colleague as an
Okay. So Lev's question is, when you register this project, actually, sorry, I'm going to take a minute here. Is there any way we can get a microphone for the audience? I would greatly appreciate it. It's hard to paraphrase these. Yeah. Thank you. So Lev's question is, when you register this project, what is best practice, I guess? I mean, you could do it either way. Should you use the same Globus ID that was used, or can you use your institutional credentials or what that as a person, as the administrator's individual credential, right? So again, this is up to your organization to make a decision. My preference here, or my recommendation here, would be for you to do this as the administrator, because we do allow multiple people to own that project and essentially not use Globus ID in the mix. If you're using high assurance, which I'm sure Bridget will remind me, Globus ID is not something that is part of the high assurance product suite. So if you're going to use this for high assurance, it is better if you don't use Globus ID in the mix there, right? So we have, and if there are gaps here, we would love to know. We have set it up such that you can create this project as yourself, add multiple people, and still have that sort of that shared responsibility. And the offboarding task in your offboarding when somebody leaves or changes roles would be to go remove them as an admin on that project. And then that kind of removes their access, right? So we've tried to recreate what we have done with administrator roles and manager and monitor roles, right? And if there are gaps there, please let us know. But that's the idea with moving to the whole client ID secret and all of that. And so, does it answer your question, Lev?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can groups be added?
Please spare me. Thank you.
Thank you. Can groups be added, Globus groups be added as admins on a project?
I'm actually not sure. No?
Yes.
Okay. Would you like that?
I think it'll make sense.
Okay.
Make
Josh
it,
is sitting right behind you.
project manager,
manager.
admins,
Yeah.
and then it's easy.
Yeah, right now I don't think we can. Okay, that's
Thank
a good
you.
request. Roger?
We actually are using a Globus ID as our admin account. Is there a downside to that?
No.
No? Okay.
No, if you're not touching high assurance data, that's not a problem. Yeah. Good question though. Anybody else? Okay, so we're going to move to the next layer layer on that diagram. So we now have an endpoint set up, right? And we have one or multiple nodes, and imagine there is a POSIX connector in there, right? So you have that default piece set up. So now you need to create a storage gateway. It really defines a set of access policies, right? And we phrase them as questions here. So the first thing is, what are authentication policies for your local account holders on that storage gateway? Which identities, which domains are acceptable, right? So for us, it says you have to log in with @uchicago.edu, right? So you would do that on your site. Is MFA required? So you could add that in. I think that's only a high assurance storage gateway option, right? So if your storage gateway is flagged as high assurance, which is the last question there, then you can say whether you need MFA or not. And then how often must a user authenticate? So if you think about it today, that is the lifetime of your certificate in X5 and in the V4 model. That is shifted as an authentication timeout here, right? Many of you who are using CA Logon have 11 days because that's an IGTF standard, and that's what CA Logon uses. Most of you do. Others who run your own MyProxy OAuth or other integrations with Globus you can set your timeout of the lifetime of your certificate, that gets translated as a configuration here for the authentication, right?
You may want to consider making MFA an option on standard Globus. And the reason I say that is that DOE will probably mandate it eventually.
Okay.
I've heard through our cyber security people that it's coming for almost everything.
Okay, that's good feedback. Thank you.
And as a CISO, we want to see it even if it's not mandated.
Okay, a CISO chat. Okay, so I will repeat. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I'll comment on that. So the comment was, as a CISO, he wants to see it everywhere. Yes, everywhere. Okay, so here is the, we support it as an option. You can set it up. Here is the challenge. Many IDPs either don't support it or don't report it. So unless the IDP can tell us that you are using, MFA, there is nothing we can do at this point, right? We have contemplated adding the second factor ourselves, but that's a whole nother product line, right? But so there is that challenge. So even if you think your IDP prompts you on your institution to log in with MFA, you should ask your IDP operators, do you release that MFA attribute? And there are standards for it that in common, and there are RFID standards around it. And if you have questions on what we use, there's documentation or come talk to us. But without that, this is kind of useless, right? The user will not be able to access the collection. We enforce it, but you're leaving the user with no choice. They just can't, they won't be able to use that identity. But yes, thank you, Richard. That's a good point. So these are the kind of questions you think about when you configure your storage gateway. And then the second question is, how do you map identities to local account? Like I said before, if we were either going from your, so if you were using CI logon and default identity mapping, then we would just go from your identity username at your campus, strip the domain piece and use it as a local account. You could set custom mapping even in V4, and you could do the same thing in V5. The only, I think, difference is that you get more authentication information. You get all my linked identities. So for mapping, the information you use for mapping, you get more information than you were previously, but then you can write your own call out, right? I think this is going to be the thing to think about when you migrate, right? If you did anything custom, if you wrote your own programs for mapping, this is probably going to be the part that you're going to have to rewrite a lot of it, or at least think about how you're going to map from new information. And then the last one is around data access. What parts of the storage system are accessible? Globus from the very beginning has supported this idea of paths that are accessible to the system itself, so that you can protect some of the other paths. And also you can set policy on what local accounts can use and deny. So anything you were doing on V4 is available on this as well, right? Okay, I guess I said all this. So the first one is the default one is stripping the identity domain. The second one talks about being able to write a custom script to be able to do the identity mapping option. There is an identity mapping guide that is linked in the GCS5 install document that walks through in detail, has examples, examples that also use other parts of the authentication context. Like you can give all my linked identities, my email information, you can map from any of that to a local account, right? So there's tons of examples there as well. Just a heads up on the identity domain. When you set the identity domain, it has to be something that Globus can recognize. So the domain has to be from that list that you see when you log in, right? That we have about, I think, 1,600 something odd list there from Incom and EduGain and a bunch of others that we have directly integrated. So you have to pick from that domain. And if you don't have that, or you don't want to use, if you don't have anything in there for single sign-on, you can install an OIDC server or use an OIDC server from your institution, and that domain can be configured in, right? And there's a process to do that on GCS. Once you're done with that, you would have this set up, right? You'd actually have a gateway that would have some policy in it. And you can see here, there's a gateway that's separate for Scratch. It's a contrived example, but you may want to do that because you may want to set different policies, right? For example, you may not enable sharing on the one that's on Scratch. I presume nobody will. Whereas the one on project, you may enable sharing and allow users to set permission for collaborators, right? So that's kind of where you would stop. Still very much an admin interface. no user is going to come discover these things or find them, right? Or use them, I guess. Okay, I am actually going to skip through this and let Joe show you how to set up the mapped collection. So once you create a storage gateway, you can add a mapped collection to it. And you have to add your storage gateway ID, a name of a mapped collection, and where it is rooted. And the collection also has configuration information, which is the same as what you would have done in V4, right? Who are the local users and groups? Is sharing allowed? What are the restrict sharing paths, if you're familiar with it, which essentially creates, which essentially allows an administrator to decide which parts of the file system a user can share with collaborators, which users can share with collaborators. You can choose to enable HTTPS, so users can come and either do transfers or access data using that. Force data channel encryption. So there are a bunch of options there for that apply to that mapped collection that is created and a user accesses, right? Okay, this is when a user comes into play. This is what they search on the Globus interface, mapped collection. So when I go into the Globus interface and search here, everything they are seeing here are mapped collections and guest collections, right? There's no storage gateways because there is no data access from it. There is no endpoints, none of that. The endpoints are actually in the console. If you go to the management console, there's a new tab that has the V5 endpoints here. Because it's an administrator thing, this is where you would go to be able to make modifications to your endpoints. But from a user perspective, it's all collections, and everything they see here is mapped and guest collections. Right? Yeah. I am going to developers.globus.org to show you a quick registration, and then I'll hand it. Or are you going to do this? Okay. Joe is going to present now.
Okay.
No, it kind of, oh, it just slipped down. How about this? Pretty powerful. All right. All right, so for this demo, let me see if I can share things. I had this guy share screen. There are way more options on sharing screen than I would have thought. I am plugged in, but I don't think I've done that yet. Okay, well, there's just multiple levels of sharing. This is my Zoom, but it's showing all my.
Share screen.
Yeah, that's this.
Oh, that's right.
See, there was way more.
Maybe desktop. Just do your whole desktop.
Desktop one.
Yeah.
I hit share. All right.
What happens if we not zoom enough?
All right, I need to click the lock. Use my magic finger. It's going to make me quit and reopen Zoom. So to share the
To
screen,
share the screen, it's going to.
you've got that. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. I just need to figure out how to see my screen on the wall there. Yeah, it's plugged in. It's just not going there. So I can do display preferences. This is the part of the demo that I didn't actually practice, so it's more exciting. Real life problem solving. Okay. Oh, something happened. Oh, surprise, it's working. Okay, I'll close. I don't think I can make that go away. Can you see that? Oh, excellent. All right, so I think we have the technology solved except for this floating Zoom window. I can quit Zoom altogether. All right. do that. Good. Do that. We're still happy. All right. Sorry about that. All right. So what I have here is a shell. I hope you can read that. I can make this slightly bigger. And what I'm going to do is go through the steps that Rachana talked about to install GCS5 on this this machine. So first off, oh yeah, you can get your own. I don't have the bit.ly.bit/ that, right? Oh, we have some whiteboard action on the side for those at home. Okay, so that's that. All right. Okay. All right, so I have a little script to kind of go through these steps and then we can see what's going on. So these are exactly what you would see in the documentation of downloading the repo, installing the repo package, updating your apt repository listings, and then installing the package. It will do a few things to sort of ensure that everything is ready for the commands to be run. And that is complete. So now I've installed the package and it's telling me that I need to go to the developer's website to get a client ID and secret. So here I am. This will be what you would see if you go to developers.globus.org. I've already created the project. If you don't have a project already, it will ask you to create one. And then you can click on the little add on the side and add a new Globus Connect server. And we will call this demo install. And there we have it. We now have a new application called demo install. It has a client ID and it has no secrets or scopes or policy configured yet. We can do that if we wanted to. Here, someone had asked earlier about adding and removing administrators. We could do that through this, which would add them to the group and not the actual project, or not the actual GCS. It's at the group level or at the project level. And you could potentially add additional Globus Connect servers within a project if you had some configuration that required completely isolated systems. Okay. So I'm going to grab this client ID and copy it over, and I just dumping it into a file here and then creating the secret. You'll be asked to give a description of what the secret is, and that is only used for informational purposes. If you happen to have multiple admins, you might want to give each one a different secret, or multiple machines or something along those lines. Generate a secret. It gives you some random looking data. You can copy it with that handy button. And then I'm going to paste that over here. And now I'm running the endpoint setup command. I'm passing in the client ID, the secret. This is the equivalent of the owner option that she showed in the slides earlier. There is also the endpoint name. You're also required nowadays to have a contact email that will be someone who will be visible when you view the endpoint document in the Globus transfer service. You can know who is responsible for that endpoint, and it can be a sysadmin group, or it can be an individual. Also required to provide an organization this will make it easier for searching for the endpoint. And then the deployment key is just the path where this key is going to be written to. They'll be asked to agree to the terms of service for Let's Encrypt. This will set up the initial TLS certificate for the service and for the endpoint, and then we'll wait a little bit while things get registered. So all the things that are happening here are things that are basically being done in memory and then stored into the cloud. This isn't going to actually install any software or write any configuration other than the deployment key to the local system. So what it's doing right now, it's registering the DNS service so that we have a a name for this endpoint, and it'll be shared across all the DTNs. Then we're going to contact Let's Encrypt, and we're going to use the DNS challenge to generate the new certificate, and then we'll be able to store that encrypted into the AppSync database, and then we'll be able to deploy it in a minute. This will be at data.globus.org, right? Sorry, that was a question about the DNS. I will repeat the question because I am so professional at this presentation thing. Yeah, so he was asking, what is this DNS going to look like? It's going to be a bunch of letters and numbers, .data.globus.org. It's not going to be terribly useful. You can customize by providing your own certificate later on. You can also customize at the collection level what the top level piece of the name is while keeping the random bits at the end if you want. So if you had, if you didn't have your own easy, convenient way to configure DNS and certificates, you could use our data.globus.org, but you could call it, research data.randomjunk.data.globus.org or university name.randomjunk.data.globus.org. And then, as I said, this is a DNS challenge. So there's a little bit of a time delay in that we have to update DNS, and then we have to wait for Let's Encrypt to see that we've put in the challenge data and that they will be able to validate it, and then we have to check with them. So it can take a couple minutes. So we can ask lots of questions now.
I'll ask more DNS questions. So is this a CNAME to the DNS name of our
This
server,
one
or how
would
does this
be,
resolve?
no. This will be an A record TN. However, at this point, since there aren't any nodes, it's just going to be the comment record that contains the challenge needed to satisfy Let's Encrypt's ACME policy to verify ownership. When we create the nodes, we can either associate them with any number of A and AAA records, and those can be useful right now, not with the Globus service, but if you had a browser, you could use IPv6 to do an HTTPS download from the Globus endpoint. All right, so now I have completed that step. So now all of the endpoint data is created. Basically, it's a skeleton that contains the ownership, the identity of who's going to be in charge of it, and the name of the endpoint, and the DNS entry. And now we're going to go over to do a bit of authentication. This is new. If you have installed V5 in the past, this is, I have a few different browsers with different permissions. I want to make sure I got the right one so I don't get my identities linked in funny ways. All right, so this is to set the advertised owner of the endpoint. So the owner string that you showed or you set in the previous step to create the endpoint is actually going to be updated in the transfer record. So I'm going to log in to Chicago, and I agree. Since I've logged into this CLI before, there's just a little bit of information, but you can see some of the other consents that are sort of implicit in that I've already consented to. I will allow that, and I will get my authorization code, and I can enter that into this one, and that is done. Okay. So after that, it gives us the endpoint ID, which you can see in Globus, and then also the domain name. So this is the randomjunk.data.globus.org. And then all of the collections were going to be subdomains of that. So there'll be sort of other random bits ahead of that, unless you do some admin configuration. Okay. So once that's done, I'm going to run, it gives you some information about things that you might have to do later. So if you're using Google Drive or Google Cloud Storage, you're going to have to eventually register a callback to the GCS Manager service so that you can have the client be trusted. So this kind of gives you information about that, although you can find this in the documentation for the connector on how to come up with this data as well. All right, so the next step is to run the node setup command here. Again, we're passing in the client ID, secret, and the path to the deployment key. Since I didn't specify an IP address, it tries hard to figure out what my public IP address is. You can specify something if it's ambiguous, or if you have multiple addresses and you want to decide what is advertised in the DNS for Globus to use. It downloads the config, and then after that, I'm doing a login of this so that the CLI will be able to communicate with the GCS manager. So it's one more visit to the auth page that we love. And that is this one. Place that. And this is authentication to allow the CLI to be able to access the management interface. So again, it remembers that. And now I'm setting the subscription ID. My identity is a subscription manager, so I'm able to do that directly. If you had a separation between your subscription manager and your sysadmin could give the endpoint ID and that was shown during the endpoint creation. And they can either do that via the CLI by logging in, as I just did, or they can go to the web app and that'll be able to set the ID as well. All right, so now I have I will write the correct command. So you can see this is the UID of the endpoint. This is my subscription ID. This is the URL of the management API. So if you wanted to use the GCS SDK, there's some support for some of the management steps, but there's also CLI used to do all the things that we need to do to configure our endpoint. And then these are the other bits that were included in that endpoint creation. And if we wanted to, we can update it, and there's all the options of what we would want to add to it: keywords, network use, concurrency, information. You could create an info link that basically just has a link about if someone visits the endpoint page on the transfer or the Globus website, they'll be able to see data about it. Okay. So next, we'll create a storage gateway. And this will allow us access to configure the policies to our data here. So for this one, I will show you this path restriction in just a sec, but we also configure it so that you must have a UChicago identity to be able to access this data on this storage. And then this last parameter is the name of the storage gateway. And then this prompt here is just from my little demo script, so that wouldn't actually show up. And then here's an example of a path restriction. If you're familiar with GCS v4, you would see something like that is roughly equivalent, although it's a little bit more structured in GCS v5 as a JSON document, so you can actually kind of make it a little bit easier to understand what's going on, and you can include lists at any of the read, write, none, and there's also a read field. So in this case, my demo space has a shared file system in /data, so that's the only place that really makes sense to use for the endpoint. So the only policy that we've set right now is the domain. We can add more. You can take a look a little bit. Oh yeah, all the connectors have their own bits of policy, so there's a separate command for each. There's a lot of commonality, but this is where you would be able to restrict who can access your endpoint with users allow and users deny. You can do more interesting identity mappings. So in this case, we have only a single identity domain of uchicago.edu. If your campus or organization has multiple, you may have to have some users go to extracting what the username looks like if they're overlapping usernames. The domain is multiple MFA and authentication timeout and high assurance allow you to control like how often and what quality a user must authenticate the resource. And then these are exactly equivalent to the groups allow and deny in GCS v4, which allow you to access to people who belong to certain POSIX groups with their local accounts. And with the other connectors, the policies can be different. They don't have necessarily the same features, so it doesn't really make sense to have a POSIX group restriction on a Google Drive or a Google Cloud Storage gateway. So if you were to do a Google one, you would have the same sort of identity mapping related ones, and then you would have these ones that will allow you to control the API rate and provide your client ID and secret that are registered with the Google. I hear that, but I don't know how to fix that. So, okay. So after the storage gateway is created, we can create a collection, and we're using the UID that was output from the and we're creating this collection. All right, so this is a good path. Okay, so as you can see here, we have the manager URL. This is to the API for managing this collection. But then we also have the HTTPS URL, which is where the data on this collection is visible. And then the TLS FTP, the grid FTP server for the collection. And keywords, those will show up and help you with. And I'm not sure if there's anything else. There's the type. Currently, the policy is to not allow guest collections. So we can, if we wanted to, select this UUID and go to the Globus app. And we can search for this ID. And there's the demo collection. If I wanted to visit it, I need to consent. I will log in as my UChicago identity. I will allow the web app to do all kinds of great things. And then you can see the root directory of this collection has only visible the data directory. You can take a look. There's some files. If you've ever done any of our tutorials in the past, there's the Go data directory that I had copied earlier. If you wanted to, at this point, you can, let's see, you can select a directory, you can create a share, you can rename files, and everything you can do with a v4 endpoint. In addition, we have these upload and get link options. So that's for using the HTTPS service. Okay, I'm going to get upgraded from number 1 to number 5. Hello. Mix. Hello. Okay. All right. So for example, we can click on this and we can download hello.txt. This is going directly to the endpoint. It redirects to auth. We consent the first time we visit it, and then it downloaded hello.txt, which says hello to us. So that's a successful demo right there. You could do everything you can do with an endpoint at this point. If there were any other steps I had, no. So that very simple, very straightforward endpoint configuration demo. I don't know if there's any other features that we need.
I'll talk through guest collections and then
Okay.
tell them about how you tested it.
Okay, very good. I will turn this on.
Okay. So the setup thus far, I guess Joe talked about guest collections as well, but he showed you how to set up a endpoint, POSIX connector, a storage gateway, and some options on how to make it high assurance, and then a map collection. I am going to pause here. Are there questions? Anything we can answer? Actually, he can answer. Yes, Todd. Actually, hang on one second. Theron is doing the yeoman's job of walking up with that. So thank you, Theron.
So yesterday, I think in one of the slides, you talked about automating this process. How in the world are you going to do that?
So I'll let them answer it, but ultimately, other than even the developer registration piece, we've been talking about adding an API and letting you do that. But outside of that piece and a user claiming ownership, right, which will require the user to authenticate, I suspect the rest can be automated with the client ID and secret, but I'll let Joe comment.
Yeah, what's the only step?
Have you turned it on? 5. Yeah.
Okay. So aside from the first step of the endpoint creation where you do the endpoint setup, everything else, well, the node setup as well, those 2 steps require some really low-level heavy lifting. The rest of the configuration can be done via API, and we have an SDK that comes with the GCS. So you can create storage gateways, collections, guest collections. You can, update mappings, configuration of, policies via either SDK or CLI. The endpoint setup, the only thing that really needs to be manual is that login step. And we actually have an option, I think, to make it so that you don't do that. But if you don't do that login step, you won't be able to set the owner of the endpoint.
So we that owner claim to be true, right? I mean, I can't arbitrarily set something as owned by you or me. So we need to be able to have that person log in, but we could automate and claim it later.
Yeah. And so there is a tool to do that. The ownership, if you don't, would just be the client ID of the endpoint. So it's not really user friendly in any way. But if you know the endpoint ID, then you can find the endpoint, which is kind of, well, you already know the endpoint ID.
Yeah.
The node setup can be completely automated. You can pass in the client ID, the secret, and the deployment key, and that's scriptable. And we actually have a Docker container that you can use to sort of see how that can be done as far as just, bringing up nodes without any intervention.
So I think we have seen 2 use cases, right? One is where people want to be able to automate bringing up nodes up and down, right? So that's one use case. The second one that was talked about was I have a CI/CD system. I want to stand something up completely from scratch, right? Just automatically up and down. Slightly distinct use cases, in my opinion, because I think you can do the first one today because you will do the registration, get your client ID, secret, deployment key, but after that, you should be able to automate the rest. The second one requires more work from our side, but doesn't seem insurmountable, certainly solvable. And we have APIs for most of these things, and for the others, there is definitely discussion. For example, the developers page, right? So there is slowly API that is built up by the IAM team for that. And that's something that we need to get done for us to be able to automate it. So that was in the last part of my presentation on things that are coming, not things we have done, but certainly pretty high up in our priority to get that done. And I think the same thing with containers. So Jason, I know, did a lot of work on Docker containers for this, and so that's something on our radar as well. So definitely, you should see something on that along this year, balanced with helping people migrate. So there's sort of that piece, right? We really are motivated to try to get people out of V4, so balanced with that. Any other questions? Anything we can answer?
Yeah, just to confirm, we've got the Google connector and the Amazon S3. So when we do this upgrade, you say it goes back and reads your 4 configuration, it'll upgrade to 5, but we'll have to reconfigure our connectors. So right now, the migration tool will only do the POSIX piece. It is not ready for other connectors. It's going to read your POSIX configuration and set it up. And then so now that you're running those in V4, you're running them as separate endpoints, right? You have separate servers because that's the only way V4 supported it. So you would first upgrade your
v4 POSIX into this. And then when we have migration tools, we will be able to read your v5 S3 deployment and add it as a gateway to your existing one. So we are anticipating many people will want to do that. We can also support if you want to do a whole new v5 endpoint that is distinct. But if you really want to keep the partition for whatever reason, we should be able to support that. But we are aware that we need to support in the migration tool a model where you're adding a gateway because you're reading your second connector type, right?
Okay, great, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions? Anything else we can answer up to this point? Bridget, anything online? Okay. So this is our setup so far. Well, Joe went beyond script. He showed you guest collections, but I will talk about guest collections now, right? So this is useful if you're a v4 admin and you have a production deploy, probably a lot of this is redundant, but if you're new and installing v5, talk a little bit about subscriptions and endpoint roles, right? So the subscriptions are at your institution level. You can have multiple subscription managers for your subscription. That is still set up today by emailing support at Globus. It is not a self-service piece, sort of setting up the subscription manager. Once you do that, the subscription manager ties an endpoint to the subscription, which is when you can add all premium connectors, have additional roles assigned for it, and so on, right? So you can set up the base piece, access all of the functionality he showed you, but all of the premium pieces that, including sharing, which Joe did show because his endpoint was managed as part of the subscription. He mentioned if the person installing it, like the owner is also the subscription manager, it's automatic, you can just associate it. If not, you would have to send your endpoint ID to the subscription manager, just like you do today. Nothing has changed in that space yet. And once you have something as managed, now you can start adding additional roles. You can have other people as administrators of your endpoint. They can make all the changes, much like you can as an owner. You can have someone as a manager. They are allowed to see all the traffic that is going between to and from your endpoint, be able to pause tasks to and from your endpoint, resume them, cancel, see all the guest collections and the permissions on the guest collection. So essentially you have full view into what is happening on your endpoint. And then if you set someone up as a monitor, it's a read-only view in there, right? So they can come in and debug everything, but they can't set pause rules, cancel tasks, and all of that, right? It's just the restriction. This is exact same as v4. Not much has changed. I think we have expanded sort of your view into these guest collections, if you will, and shared endpoints, so you can do more things there than you were able to do previously, which was something administrators wanted. They want to be able to see all the ACLs and make changes. So as an admin of a map collection, you can pretty much make changes to a guest collection other than touch data on it. You don't get data access, but if you see an offending permission that you don't want, you can remove it, you can delete it, you can do all of those things. So we've added that over the last year, right? Did I cover that right, Bridget? Okay. Okay, so I already talked about this. Making your endpoint managed. So for people who are following along on the spreadsheet, Greg is not here, but maybe Vas can make these managed. Yes. So if you can put your endpoint ID in the spreadsheet, then he can set it as managed. So you can also try the rest of the pieces, right? Set it up as enable sharing and set up permissions, create guest collections, and so on. But once you have this, either Vas can do that, or if you were doing it on your own, you would be running this. If you're a subscription manager, that's the command that you would run, right? Okay, so once you set up, if you set up your mapped collection and enable sharing on it, and you will see that as an option, sharing set to true, that can be done if your endpoint is managed, then your users can create guest collections, right? This is I'm describing this in an admin tutorial, but it's not something an admin does. So your users can then log in, just like he showed you on the Globus web app, pick a folder and share, and I'll do that demo for a second, in a second here. And the user can grant access to other collaborators. People accessing the guest collection do not have to have a local account, and their access happens as the user who's granting them permissions, right? And the guest collections are rooted within the map collection. So you can't essentially break out of that. And as an administrator, you can also set share restrict paths, which Joe will show you. on V5, which will let you restrict your map collection further to ensure user can only share from a subset of that map collection, right? So this is sort of showing you some of the restrictions there. You can decide which set of user is allowed to share. So your user base may have access to the map collection and they may have local accounts, but you can further restrict who's allowed to share within there, right? There's a allow list, a deny list, and it's a POSIX. If it's a POSIX connector, you could also do a POSIX group that is allowed to share or deny sharing, right? And then this is the share restrict paths, which now in V5 it's a JSON, just like the restrict paths was that he showed you. There's a share restrict path. So if my map collection is, let's say, across /projects, I can then still take, /project/ I don't know, one particular project 1, and say you're allowed to share only from that. So you can set that as a shared restrict path. So as an administrator, you have lots of controls in terms of how you draw the boundaries so that the user can share with their collaborators, but still meeting your policy requirements, right? And I think it would be useful for you to show that command when you do the walkthrough, or at least the JSON, right? Actually, let me do a quick sharing demo of some people have not seen. Globus pulled up. Okay, so if I go to Midway here, so this is a, so the UChicago RCC Midway in the V5 Padlands is a mapped collection, right? An admin set it up. They are mapping our UChicago IDs to our local accounts, right? Now I can pick a folder there as a user because they have enabled sharing on that map collection. And because I'm not in any of those deny lists or anything I'm allowed to share, I can pick a folder and I can essentially create a guest collection. This is V4, so you're seeing this terminology. It's in V5, it would be a guest collection, right? So I can give a name for that guest collection, keywords, description, and all of that. But importantly, I can set permissions now. So I can add permission for a user. I can search for users in the Globus namespace, or be able to add permissions for somebody who has never logged into Globus, right? This kind of goes back to a question that we were talking about provisioning and deprovisioning accounts. We have this idea where you can set permission for someone that Globus has never seen, and essentially where the user claim that account. When they come in, we match that, right? So you don't need the user you're sharing with to have come to Globus before. So let's say I share with Vas at globus.org. You can set permissions for a user, a group, a Globus group, or give access to all users. You can give read permissions or write permissions on that. And he will be only able to download just that data folder, right? The user gets an email saying data has been shared. And then when they essentially open up this, shared endpoint, they'll only see what is within that data, essentially, that folder. So it's restricted, and all access that happens on that is logged as my local account, right? It happens through my local account. Nothing has changed in V5. If you're familiar with this in V4, it's the same security model and same thing. So V5 does support HTTP as access. The collection configuration governs whether that access is allowed. It's supported for map collections and for guest collections. It applies the same security, which is why Joe had to log in, right, on the HTTPS server to show that, prove his identity and download. Admins have controls. You can turn on or off HTTPS access. You can also turn off anonymous access to HTTPS if you so want, right? It's automatically turned off for all high assurance collections. But if you're not using high assurance and you still don't want anonymous access, you can turn that off. Okay, Joe, can you show the share restrict paths? I guess you showed guest collection creation. Yes.
I have to apologize. I was looking on the wrong screen in the online questions.
Okay, go for it.
So if there.
Actually, I'm losing track of, where are we on time? We have 15 minutes, right? Yeah, so we need, yeah. Can you hold, because we want to talk talk about migration, and then maybe we could look at the online questions and answer them online, or pick them up towards the end.
Sure.
Right. Okay, so I think I'm going to switch to migration, given the time. Okay. So I'm sure you have lots of questions. I'm sure as you set up GCS5, you're going to run into things. Please take a look at our documentation. The quick start guide and the detail guide have lots of information. Our help desk support at Globus anytime. And today, if you're here, you can walk over after the session. The devs are going to be available at the office hours, so you can walk over and ask your questions, right? Just want to switch to migration here and talk a little bit about what the tools do, right? Again, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to do some slideware, and then Joe will show you a quick walkthrough. So some of the goals for the migration tools: no user intervention should be required. We don't want users to have to come back and reset permissions, create guest collections, or anything of that sort, right? So it's an administrator action and go there. It automatically recreates all the host and guest endpoints. I guess it's shared endpoints there, right? From v4, it's completely recreated there. Preserve all the relevant configuration. I put relevant in there because there are cases where we have done custom configuration. Somebody tells us there's this esoteric thing, and we have given them some, actually we blame Mike for it. He gives them all these grid FTP configuration, fancy stuff that is hard for us to detect, and it's not a vanilla v4, right? So there might be some things we might have to work with you, but the migration tool will tell you about it, right? I know, Mike. We have preserved the UUIDs of all these resources because there might be integration, right? You might have a portal that is accessing this particular v4 endpoint, and we want to make sure those things don't break. So we have kind of moved all those things over and minimized downtime. There will be downtime because the last step of reassigning that UUID means your v4 has to go down. So there will be some downtime, but we have tried to give you steps that will minimize that, right? So that's the first thing. You have to plan for some downtime. The length of the downtime depends. If you're a multi-DTN deployment, the downtime can be highly minimized because you can set everything up, test it, and then you're just going to be able to move it over, and only when you move it over, it'll go down. But if you're not a multi-DTN endpoint, then you're going to have to pull it down and reinstall v5 on that machine, right? All active transfers during that finalized step of migration will be canceled. So if you haven't told your users, or people are still moving data, that will be canceled, and the users will automatically receive an email from the transfer service that was canceled during migration, right? Pause rules, there are a few of you who you use them during maintenance and things. They are not preserved across these, right? We were not able to move that over, so you would have to recreate your pause rules. There's an API that lets you get them, so you can get those pause rules and recreate. Any application that was leveraging v4, I'm not going to go through this in detail today in this presentation, but if you have users who are integrated with v4, especially host endpoints, which required activation, those applications are going to require change because there is no certificates anymore. They're going to require consent. There is a guide linked off of our migration page that gives them all the details of what that change looks like. It's just that one step of activation changes, right? But so this is going to require informing users that you're making this migration, and if they have written any application that uses that, they have to make the change. Most automations should not be using map collection or host endpoints anyway. They probably are using shared endpoints because you cannot automate on host endpoint. So we think that's a smaller issue, but portals or other people who have written code will have to make some change there, and the SDK supports that. I'll touch on it during the developer tutorial, but there is a guide that walks you through this, right? So the general approach for the migration tool has been read your v4 configuration and create this migration plan. It's essentially a YAML document. Okay. That does not affect your v4 deployment. So you can do that today, and it will not cause any issues for your production deployment. And that essentially reads your v4 and tries to give you information about what the v5 will look like, and also flag issues. If we don't know how to make something work on v5 based on that, it'll flag it and give you helpful pointers to documentation. Or that's the point where you talk to support if the documentation doesn't deal with your esoteric deployment, right? But we think we can get most of the vanilla deployments, the single DTNs, the standard deployments that are there should work. Then it also allows edits and changes to the plan to make it to make it look like what you want. And then you apply the plan to a vanilla V5 install. So that's when you would use everything we talked about in the last hour, do a full V5 install and run a tool that reads that YAML configuration and applies it to the V5 install. Then you can test your V5, and then the finalized step essentially takes the UUID from V4 and applies it to V5, right? That's when your V4 is completely lost. So that's the general approach to those tools. There is a migration guide that has a step-by-step walkthrough. It is linked off the V5 page that talks about how to do this. And it also has error codes that might come up in your migration plan that says, we don't know how to do this, or here's where you need to look more. And the documentation explains what those error codes mean, right? For you to think about probably identity mapping or any V4 configuration that we are not able to understand what it is in an automated way. Okay, now I'm going to pass this off to Joe, and he's going to do a walkthrough. The first step of what he's going to show, you can actually run on your V4 install. And if you can generate that migration plan, you can bug these guys to help you if there are any questions on that, right? So you can take that to the office hours, or also send that to our support team if you need further help.
Number 5. I'm on. All right. I plugged it in. I think I just, oh, I don't even need to tell it. Okay. All right, just to set some context for this demo, I'm going to close out some of these old windows. So for demo purposes, I've created a GCS v4 endpoint. I have created a guest collection on it. It has 2 servers. So I'm going to show you the migration as part of a multi-DTN. If you have a single DTN, then you can sort of pretend that the second or the final steps don't happen. Okay. So the first thing that we'll do is install the migration tools. So we're going to create a Python virtual environment. We're going to install a wheel that contains the tools. It's going to download all the dependencies, and hopefully this will take a couple seconds, and that's done. All right. At this point, we should now have a virtual environment that we can use, and we're going to create the migration plan. So this is a command that you're going to run on your GCS v4 endpoint. And what it's going to do is it's going to parse the GCS configuration file, the grid FTP configuration files, your grid map files if you have any, all of your GSI authorization configuration files. It's going to poke into the transfer service and read about your endpoint and just gather all the information that exists for your endpoint. All right, so the first thing we have to do is we need to log in. So apparently I forgot to put that into my demo script. So we'll do that. And at this point, as you log in here, we're going to have to log in using the Globus ID that is the administrator of the GCS v4 endpoint, because we need to be able to poke around at all the data associated with the endpoint. So I will go to, I think this is the correct, yeah, this is the right browser. I will log in as my admin. What did I call that? Sorry about that. I forgot my demo name. It was a little bit longer than I thought it would be. What is it called? GW 2022 migration. All right. Log in with the Globus ID. Again, we see the familiar consent page, and we get the code. Windows open. Here we go. I will enter the security code, and now I'm logged in. Now we can do creating the migration plan. All right. So normally, it will be able to find the endpoint ID because there'll be a file that's written on the file system. But if you have a multi-DTN endpoint, it's only going to see the endpoint ID on the first DTN that you've created, just because that file is not written in all cases. But since we know the ID from here, be able to grab that. All right, so you can see that it parsed the endpoint state, the roles, the shares, and then there's a little bit of a warning about something that could go wrong. This warning is, for most people, innocuous. In some specific cases, if you had a share that was created and then moved to a different path, you would have manually updated the sharing state file, and that is not reflected in the transfer service. So the trick, however, is that sharing state file is created by the local user who created the share. So it may not be readable by the user running the migration tool. So there's a warning about what to do. Basically, you're going to have to SU to the particular user to be able to update those particular sharing state files, but only if the situation was that you've moved a share. All right. So the next step is we can do we can run the check command, and that basically it reads through all of the state that it has parsed out and tells you about things that might be wrong. You'll always see some user credential things if you have any shares, because you haven't defined what the mapping looks like quite yet. And then there's a few things that might be in your grid FTP configuration that need to be handled separately. So the data interface is one, just because the way that the nodes are modeled is a little bit different between v4 and v5. So actually, I was going to take a little trip through the migration plan. So you can see every guest collection is going to have some YAML documents that describe the collection, the user that created the collection, the ACLs that were associated with the collection, all the roles. There'll also be information about the endpoint sort of decomposed into both the storage gateway and a mapped collection, and then some other metadata that we need to keep track of to ensure that we have all of the identity mapping stuff available for completing the migration. So the next step is to decide what our identity mapping is. So this is probably the most complicated potentially for a v4 migration. If you're just using CI logon and you have a organization that has a single domain, it's extremely straightforward. If you have a mix of that plus grid map entries, then it can get more complicated, because you're going to have to figure out what identities these grid map X509 certificates really mean in Globus land. With CI logon, it's pretty clear what domains are associated with an organization, although there may be a large number of them depending on what their identity policies are. So in this case, my endpoint is purely a UChicago one. So we will go and we'll fix up the identity mapping. First, we see there's this command, identity mapping list, and it will show all the mapping options that were enabled on the endpoint. So in this case, because it was CI logon, we have 2 entries for that for various reasons. We can talk about that at office hours. And it flags those as requiring attention. And then I have an empty grid map file, so there's really nothing that needs to be worried about for that. So if you had other things that were configured, or if you had multiple CI logons, which is possible if you've gotten some support, they'll all be listed there, and you can, there's steps in the documentation that describe how to deal with them. So for our case, since we have only a single one, we're going to run the GCS migration identity mapping command with the CI logon command. And since there's only one mapping, it can determine everything by default. Otherwise, you're going to have to come up with the organization if there are multiple organizations that you have configured in your GSI security authorization configuration. And then if you have multiple domains associated with an organization, you would also have an option here to choose which ones you want to map. Okay. In this case, it's very simple. There is only a single identity domain. And so now if we do list identity mappings, it no longer marks them as needing attention. So what has happened here is that the policy for the storage gateway has been created that says for this collection, use the uchicago.edu as the domain and do the default mapping. So that would be equivalent to what the EPPN would look like. All right. So after that, we can run the check again, and it doesn't show much other than the data interface might be a little bit in need of repair, but we can deal with that later. And then the final steps, we're going to install GCS v5. So we're going to uninstall first all of the packages. We're going to clean up the existing endpoint. So we're just doing the Globus Connect Server cleanup command from v4, and that's going to delete all the local configuration files that were created by GCS. You can back those up beforehand if you're nervous. That's fine. We're going to uninstall all the packages that were in v4. And actually, no, because this is a multi-DTN endpoint. So if we go back to the server here, we can see it had servers too, and now it's got a single server. So the endpoint will continue to work with everyone except for the one that I'm doing this command on. So now we're going to install GCS v5. It installs a whole lot of packages, including all the connectors and the services. This should look very familiar from the previous demo. And
I just want to know a little bit on the identity mapping piece, right? First, there are way more single DTN deployments of Globus than multi-DTN. But if you do have multi-DTN, strongly recommend doing what Joe is doing, right? Which is take one node out of your v4, do the full install, get your v5 tested, and then get that set up as a v5, and then move that piece, right? But there are lots of single DTN ones, so running the migration check, making sure all of that looks good is not a downtime. So that's what you would do if you're a single DTN. Make sure that you've gotten to a point where there are no issues with that. And then once you start doing what he just did, uninstalling, then you start essentially pulling down that DTN and doing that, right? So that's one more. Then the other thing I want to talk about was just the identity mapping. So we have accounted for pretty complicated deployments, especially in large facilities where they allow people to log in with multiple domains. So you can log in with, your NERSC identity or your LBNL identity or your other one. So those are the cases where their mapping configuration is really complicated. It is not simple for us to say, go from Joe at NERSC to local account Joe, because there could be another Joe at LBNL, right? So those are the cases where it is not possible to determine what the right mapping is without you telling us what the right mapping is. So that's when you're going to see a lot of these configuration pieces. Vast majority that use a single MyProxy OAuth server that use the default mapping mechanism or use a single grid map file or something like that, it's just going to be using the same thing, but moving away from a DN to an identity to do this, right? So I'm not trying to trivialize the issue, but I'm also saying that the migration tools are catering to a vast, vast majority of deployments across the spectrum. Some would just use a lot of our default options and some that don't, right? So the options that you see here, they've made sure that they flag it wherever they can. They are able to pick up and figure out how to just move it forward without your intervention. But in cases where there's any ambiguity, it flags so that you're double checking what you want your mapping to look like and testing it before you put that in, right? So just want to add that to your.
Right, and that's fine because we have seen the install delay while we get the certificate and DNS registered. So I guess one other thing to be aware of with the mapping is that with v4, the account that the user logs into Globus has no real relationship to the account that they use to log in to your endpoint because the activation is completely separate. In GCS v5, they're all converged. So there may be some users that may have to link identities if they haven't done that already, if they've been logging in with their Google email address and using that to activate their university identity. So they may have to do something for that. So just something to be aware of, that it's a much more coherent picture you'll see with migration step. Again, we're waiting for this certificate registration to happen. So for the other options, so this was just the CI logon identities. If you had an OID or a MyProxy or MyProxy OAuth, what you would do here is after you set up the Globus endpoint, you could configure either some other identity provider that does the equivalent of what your MyProxy is doing, or you can use the Globus OIDC server as something that's equivalent for your identity mappings. There's also, if you have grid map entries, you'll probably want to either have a call out or write some sort of translation to figure out what these DN strings mean as far as your Globus user identities, which that might be something that will take some detective work if people are just giving you certificates. But if they're coming from a specific set of organizations, then it should be reasonably straightforward. All right, so now finishing up the install. Setting up the node, configuring the endpoint. And at this point, I'll have a GCS v5 endpoint that has no storage gateways, no collections. It's just I've set up a node so that I can interact with the API and the CLI. So now there's a command called endpoint migrate. You log in one more time because there's all these little apps doing different things. And you can see there's no storage gateways, there's no collections. So we're going to run migrate for. That last login was just so that I could show you that there's nothing there to see. Okay, with the migrate for, you have to log in using the Globus ID. So we'll do that over here. We just keep making tokens. All right. Oh, and this is a part that I missed in my demo, is I forgot to set the subscription ID on my endpoint. So since I had a guest collection, it marked that as something that it can't do. So I'll set that. Connect server. That's the right one. Set subscription ID. Yes. Sorry about that. Oh. Okay, I've got a few different users that I'm logging in as. So I just want to make sure I've got the right token. It's the wrong one. Sorry about that. Now it should work. Okay, as you can see, it runs all the checks when you attempt to actually run the endpoint migrate command, so you can't sneak something by at this point. If it was something that was a critical error, like some of them are sort of informational that things have changed in the way that you configure it, and some of it is you haven't accounted for something critical as far as the identity mapping and refuse to make any storage gateway with the long name that's based on the original endpoint's name. And then we've created the guest and mapped collections, and we can visit those in the browser if we wanted to. I'm over time. All right. I have one more step then. We're going to believe that those collections exist. We'll run the finalize step. And this is the thing that actually will convert all of the UUIDs. It's going to make sure that everything is still in correct state as it was expecting when it did the migration. It's going to rewrite all the UUIDs, and then it will make it so that the other DTNs are now completely unable to be accessed by Globus because that endpoint no longer exists. The new endpoint has the old endpoint ID. You can then go to the other endpoints, run the node setup command by copying over the deployment key from your node that you did the migration on, and everything should be set up for you. Yeah.
Okay, so that was quite quick towards the end, but I strongly encourage you to run the first migrate translation on your port DTNs, and take a look at it. If there's questions,